We're going to move to one of the highlights of BX 2018, Professor Kaz Sunstein's keynote address. What's truly terrific with this session is that there is going to be time to ask Kaz some questions. For this session and for all sessions, if you're going to ask any question in person, please provide your name and your organisation. I'm now going to pass to Kate Phillips, the Principal of the Victorian Behavioural Insights Unit. Kate will facilitate the conversation with Kaz. Please welcome Kate to the lectern. Thanks.
Thanks, David. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Today, as you know, we're lucky enough to have with us Kaz Sunstein, a preeminent scholar in improving human knowledge of decision-making. Kaz is currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard and is the founder and director of the program on behavioural economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. From 2009 to 2012, Kaz was the United States' regulatory Tsar, otherwise known as the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. A small office with a big impact, OIRA ensures that the benefits to society of any regulatory action outweigh the potential costs. Kaz's areas of expertise are wide-ranging and include behavioural economics, labour law, environmental law, constitutional and administrative law. And earlier this year, Kaz was awarded the Holberg Prize for his work on the modern regulatory state and constitutional law. Kaz's research has had and continues to have far-reaching impacts on many areas of public policy, ranging from simplifying government to identifying the best tools for the policy objectives sought. I've had the great privilege to learn from Kaz's infamous Socratic method when taking his class on behavioural economics, law and public policy, and would reflect that Kaz's incredible intellect is matched by his humility and his willingness to hear any argument out. Today, Kaz will speak with us about the relationship between ethics and behavioural insights. And in this keynote, Kaz will present an ethically grounded framework for us to consider as we're developing behavioural interventions, based on the implications for welfare, autonomy, dignity, and self-government. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kaz Sunstein.
So, it would be very bad to come to an amazing audience and be naked. It's even worse to have no slides, but magically, they've appeared. It's a complete thrill to be here. I can see each one of your faces. Hi, everybody. And to be in this country which has become a world leader on these topics is completely inspiring. I have a lot to say, so I'm going to give two ideas by way of orientation. The first is in the nature of breaking news, which is we now have data from a significant number of the world's countries on whether people approve of nudges, and the breaking news includes Australia and South Korea and Ireland and France and Germany and lots of others. The really new data is from Australia. And it turns out that among the nudges that are under serious consideration or actually have been adopted by countries that have been interested in behavioral insights, the approval rates are really high. In fact, if you look at most of the world's liberal democracies, even in some that have had their liberal democracy under some pressure, in those countries, the approval rates are typically on the order of 70 to 88%. And this cuts across partisan lines. So it's extremely hard to read the data in a way that makes political orientation highly relevant to whether there is approval. The approval rates are strong majorities in Australia, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Italy, multiple others. There are two exceptions, and this is the one of two themes I want to kind of underline at the outset. If people think that a behaviorally informed policy is inconsistent with people's values or interests, they start to get nervous. So if it's the case that there's an intervention that is taking their money away for a cause that they're not sure they like, then they're not going to approve it. And it's a very identifiable category. Second, and this is the only other exception, if people think that a nudge or a behaviorally informed policy is illicitly motivated, if it's motivated by religious or political favoritism, for example, or by a desire for politicians to entrench their own interests, then they stop liking it. Those are the two categories: inconsistent with people's values or interests, or illegitimately motivated. Outside of those categories, there is very strong, to say it's a majority is too modest, overwhelming public support for behaviorally informed interventions. The data we have, by the way, suggests this is not true for mandates and bans. That the value of nudges appreciated by citizens, by the way, not just in Australia, the United States, and Germany and France, but also in Russia and China. The value of behaviorally informed mandates, and yes, we have nationally representative data from Russia and China, is that they are choice preserving. And that softens people's concerns about what government is doing. A mandate or a ban will run into more opposition. And I think there is, in what I've just said, the core of an ethical program, and as I'll describe, the core of a behavioral bill of rights, we can call it, that can orient understandings about what governments legitimately do. The second thing, aside from the data, and this will be normative remarks with only episodic resort to data, you've heard most of what I've got for today. The second kind of orienting idea is if I were, with my great friend Thaler, to redo nudge, we would place a greater emphasis than we did on an unwieldy word, navigability. The basic idea, and I hope every language that's represented in this room has a term for navigability, maybe shorter and more musical ones. The idea is that life, whether you're facing a problem of making ends meet, or of getting your weight under control, or finding a satisfying job, or making your retirement simpler, or finding a place to live that would be a good place to live, life often creates a problem of navigability. And the trick of a behaviorally informed intervention is to make the problem of navigability go away. And I hope it's clear that I'm using the term to suggest navigability writ very large. That what behaviorally interested people have, I think, devoted too little attention to in the first generation of work is the pervasiveness, especially for people who face economic or other forms of deprivation, in navigating lives which, for those who don't face economic or other forms of deprivation, are challenging but not infuriating to navigate. And a spotlight placed on the problem of navigability, I think, provides an organizing framework that can both help identify good policies and also help us to understand the ethical challenges. Okay, so in terms of what we're going to do, we're going to provide an overview as distinguished from the preface. You've just heard the preface, overview coming, then orientation, which are some organizing remarks, then 8 objections and concerns, which will culminate in a kind of nudger's bill of rights. Okay, so that's going to be unveiled. It's not that exciting, but it is going to be unveiled for the first time today. Then we'll have an epilogue. Okay, overview. We're going to have to get a little philosophical here and notice, contrary to the great Derek Parfit, one of the great philosophers of the last 50 years, there are 2 principal foundations in many nations, including nations that aren't particularly Western, for thinking about ethics. One is a conception of welfare, and the other is a conception of autonomy. Mill is, I think, the greatest exponent of a welfarist conception of what government faces when it's seeking not to transgress ethical boundaries, and Kant is the great theorist of autonomy. I'll have something to say about dignity as well, which is a close cousin, as I'll be understanding it, to autonomy, and also, of course, something about self-government. In terms of conclusions, and this is to give the game away at the outset, Objections to choice architecture and nudging as such are literally pointless. The private sector nudges, as does government, and that can't be avoided. So the global objection has no point. Nudging takes multiple forms, which means that ethical abstractions can disorient us. And I want to focus on this particularly because my interest in this comes from a magnificent conference in Berlin a few years ago, where ethical abstractions, understandably, given the East German legacy, were all afoot. And they are helpful, but they are potentially disorienting. If we are following Mill and thinking about social welfare as our guide, some nudging is actually required on ethical grounds. A failure to nudge is what raises the ethical problem, and navigability might be helpful in thinking why. If autonomy is our guide, much nudging is also required on ethical grounds. That is suggestive, though not demonstrative, of the need for a Bill of Rights for nudging. Okay, in terms of track record, some kind of highlights of what's happened over the last 8 years. Automatic enrollment in savings programs in Denmark, the United Kingdom, the United States, and elsewhere has produced billions of dollars in savings available for people who would otherwise have tough retirements. And that's an abstraction, that word billions of dollars, and the exchange rate doesn't matter for it to be a lot. I was an English major, so I can't kind of figure out the arithmetic, but this is a lot of money, and it's making a big difference in people's prospects for the future. More movingly to me is an anti-poverty program, which is for children, not older people, which gives poor kids in the United States a right to free school meals, lunches and breakfasts. Now, this is a program which has not been taken up by large numbers of eligible families for reasons that remain somewhat obscure. I think the basic explanation is there's a problem of navigability. The way the US government solved the problem of navigability was to authorize state and local officials directly to certify people so the kids are automatically in the program. They don't have to sign up. They can opt out. It's not mandatory by any means, but they're automatically in. The result is that 10 million children in one nation are receiving school meals to which they're entitled. And while that's a number, I am quite confident that if you saw outside of that room a very small number of those children here to celebrate the program, there wouldn't be a dry eye in the house. There's a credit card law from a few years ago, which is behaviorally informed. It was done by kind of off-the-rack reference to behavioral findings about salient information and default rules. The effect of the law is to save, and this is astounding to me, billions of dollars annually, where the disproportionate number of those dollars are going to people with poor credit ratings. That might not have been anticipated, but on ethical grounds, it's a phenomenal result. It suggests that people who have been struggling with credit cards, hence they have poor credit ratings, they're the principal beneficiaries of the behaviorally informed interventions. There's a recent paper in which has, I think, approximately 87 authors. I think I'm a co-author 86 of the 80s. No, I'm sorry, I'm 87, I admit it. I'm the last of the 87. But it shows, I think to the surprise of at least 82 of the 87 co-authors, that nudges are crushing mandates and bans in terms of cost effectiveness. That doesn't mean that they are producing more dramatic overall outcomes than mandates and bans. It means for every public or private dollar spent, they're producing more on the ground. Okay, that's track record. William Blake, the great English poet, was a critic of Sir Joshua Reynolds, the great English artist, and wrote in preserved marginalia to Sir Joshua Reynolds' great lectures on art. He wrote, "To generalize is to be an idiot. To particularize is the alone distinction of merit." He also wrote, "I thank God I am not like Reynolds." I think for those of us thinking about ethical issues and other instruments, this is a beacon, Blake's words. Now, it is true that to generalize is to be an idiot, to particularize is the alone distinction of merit, is a generalization. But let's not be fussy. Blake was basically right. The results I've described from Australia and other countries are highly particularized. They are about identifiable nudges from which we can elicit relatively particular ethical rules. Okay, following Blake, here's a kind of roadmap for the universe of nudges. Default rules are the gold medal winner, I think. They are the Usain Bolt of nudges. They work really fast and they have a massive impact. Simplification doesn't quite come in for a gold or silver or bronze medal, but it's really good. If we were going to have a silver medalist for nudges, it would be information disclosure, I think, which helps account for the power of the credit card law and helps account for the power of calorie labels, which in at least some areas are having a significant impact on caloric intake. Warnings and reminders probably stand with information disclosure as the same family. Increases in ease and convenience, uses of social norms, non-monetary rewards, active choosing, and pre-commitment strategies all belong on the list of contenders, though it's not clear whether they get medals. The one that deserves to be called out here, I think, is active choosing and prompted choice. How many people in this room are planning to get a new automobile in 2018? Okay, we just increased by a little bit the number of automobile sales in Australia in 2018. You're welcome, automobile dealers in Australia. The reason is just asking people to make a choice for reasons that are extremely interesting increases the relevant behavior, and the interesting reason is human attention. It focuses human attention on the thing. Okay, Thaler and I define the objective as influencing choices in a way that will make choosers better off as judged by themselves. This is in italics, and I wish we had signaled the notion of navigability right after that sentence, and it's usually pretty simple. It is the lodestar. Breaking news with respect to that criterion comes from my contender for the best behavioral insight paper of 2017. It's from Bergman and Rogers. It's a test of how enrollment defaults affect the take-up of an education technology. Let's stipulate that it's a technology that's really helpful to kids, so it's educationally beneficial. The standard opt-in approach produced 1% usage rate. Pathetic, yes? A simplified enrollment strategy, that's a quite good idea, and it should be helpful, worked in the sense that the rate increased from 1% to 8%, which is basically on the order of good results highlighted in reports from behavioral insights teams all over the world. That's a success story. But from the standpoint of the educational system, it's not magnificent. Automatically enrolling parents in the educational technology created 96% usage rate. Almost everyone used it with automatic enrollment. What makes that especially stunning is that district leaders, that it's people whose job it is to understand this stuff, underestimated take-up enrollment by 31 percentage points and overestimated take-up under the standard condition by 38 percentage points. Okay, what's stunning there is that people whose job it is to know all about what interventions work and how much the impact they had way overstated the benefits of opt-in and way understated the effect of opt-out. Okay, with respect to the inevitability point, there's a study of the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is economics papers for economists. There's an order in which papers are listed. That can't be avoided, can it? There has to be an order. The finding is that the papers that are listed first are downloaded more than the other papers. That shouldn't happen. These are economists who are given a list of papers, some of which are in their expertise and some of which are not. And yet the order greatly matters in terms of popularity in exactly the situation in which it ought not to. That's an example of the inevitability of choice architecture. Any lawyer or doctor, any legal system, any cafeteria or store or website will inevitably have a choice architecture which will nudge. That has an effect on assessment of the ethical issues. Right now, not right now, but 2 hours ago and 9 hours from now, involved in doing a new book with Danny Kahneman, which is on human error in general. And our current idea, we'll see if this survives the test of time, is to have a section of the book which is on what we call the evaluative biases or the big biases. There's actually, in behavioral work, often a dozen or 100 biases, including, if you'll forgive, there's sexual overperception bias, and there's also sexual underperception bias. And it's fair to ask, I think, in both those cases, is that a bias which describes behavior, or is that just a redescription of behavior? Which is to say that the proliferation of biases is becoming a bit of a problem. It might be bias over perception bias. If we're thinking of the big biases, the three ones that dominate behavioral work, I think, are present bias, which is to say, today and tomorrow really matter. Next year is a foreign country, and people aren't sure whether they're going to visit. People are often unrealistically optimistic, which accounts for the planning fallacy and the overvaluation of good news relative to bad news, the fact that 94% of university professors in one study think that they're better than the average university professor, and the fact that 90% of drivers in some studies suggest they're better than the average driver, and the fact that 100% of people in all studies think their sense of humor is better than the average. The fact that losses loom greater than gains is a behavioral bias that is pervasive. It has to do probably with evolutionary pressures where if a tiger is chasing you, you'd better be really scared. You might lose. And if there's something wonderful on the horizon, go for it, absolutely, but not with the same urgency with which you avoid losses. Okay, now I'm going to talk about 8 objections and concerns, and this is going to be mostly responding to the concerns, but also trying to learn something from them with the ultimate goal of building up toward a kind of Bill of Rights. Okay, the first objection is that behaviorally informed policies tend to be paternalistic. That's probably fair. They are soft and means-oriented forms of paternalism, like a GPS device. So the best behaviorally informed interventions from the private and public sector, they have 2 characteristics that distinguish them from many forms of paternalism. A, they are highly respectful of people's ends. And 2, I mangled the letters and the numbers to make sure you're listening. Get that? A and 2. Should have been A and B. And 2, they allow people to go their own way. So these are forms of paternalism that are ends respecting, like a GPS, and that are freedom preserving in the sense that people can say, no, I don't like the intervention. Often there's no neutral way to proceed in the sense that there's a choice architecture in place for a website or an office or a form. If welfare is the master concept, nudges might be justified or required on welfare grounds, and that is a strong candidate for our ethical test. If autonomy is the master concept, and that's also a contender for a master test, nudges might be justified or required. Think, for example, of calorie labels, which are an effort to enable people to avoid health risks. Those are, if they're designed properly and working well, promoting welfare, and they are certainly promoting autonomy because they are ensuring informed choices. Okay, the only wrinkle I want to add here, signaled by the opening address you just heard, is that choices everywhere can be autonomy reducing. So if you've ever been in a taxi to the airport and the driver has uttered to you the following horrific words, "Which route would you like me to take?" That's a metaphor, I'm suggesting, for contexts in which freedom of choice ought to be preserved, but insistence on active choicing in autonomy's name is actually autonomy reducing because it prevents people from focusing on the thing on which they want to focus. Lawyers in many governments are insistent on active choosing for people who are interacting with government, and that's often a good idea, but it's often not in their interests because it takes their time away. So to give people a default, which they can use if they like, is often more autonomy protective. There's a great concern, and this is something that I think is especially honorable concern, about the risk that behaviorally informed use of behavioral insights can be manipulative. To make progress on this concern, we need to have a definition of what manipulation is, and there is a very active and I think instructive philosophical debate over the best understanding of the term. Putting the concept of manipulation as discussed in the philosophical literature into behavioral terms, it's probably best understood as a suggestion that some ways of interacting with our fellow citizens are exploiting or addressing their system one and not giving their system two, their reflective system, a fair chance. So for those of you for whom the system one, system two distinction is new, this is something psychologists have spoken of for a long time, where system one is the automatic system two is the more deliberative and reflective system. Like any good father, I explained this to my son when he was 5 years old, when he was having trouble going by toy stores without needing to go in. And I told him, your system one really needs to go in. Your system two thinks, I already have plenty of toys. Rely on your system two. That helped for a few weeks. But after that time, he turned to me and he said, "Daddy, do I even have a system two?" I wasn't quick enough to tell him that you wouldn't ask the question if you didn't. I instead grieved and panicked. Okay, nudges should be transparent and unhidden. They should be subject to public scrutiny and review. They should not exploit system one and not give system two, the deliberative part of our cognitive processes, a fair chance. Okay, as noted, there is widespread approval of nudges, except when people don't like them on the merits because they seem illicitly motivated or inconsistent with people's values or interests. People do not object to default rules. They do not see automatic enrollment in green energy or automatic enrollment in savings plans as troublesome. They object to default rules not because they're manipulative, but because and when the thing into which people are being defaulted isn't something that it's in their interest to be defaulted into. Okay, human dignity, an idea pressed by philosopher Jeremy Waldron in the behavioral context in particular, emphasizes the risk that some behaviorally informed interventions are disrespectful to persons. That's a very important concern from which I think we all can learn and on which it's appropriate to focus. A GPS might be, annoying, but it isn't humiliating unless there's a new technology of which I'm unaware, which is very high-handed with respect to drivers. A reminder or a warning is not typically disrespectful unless it's framed in a certain way. If people choose not to choose, then we ought to beware of something that I think should be on government's view screen. It certainly was on mine when I was in our government. That is choice requiring paternalism. To force people to choose in contexts in which they don't want to, that is offensive to their dignity because it requires them to devote their attention to something which, on reflection, they don't want to devote their attention. Learning can be important, and I'll have something to say about that pretty soon. Okay, it's now standard, at least in some circles, to emphasize that default rules may not be as different from coercion as they seem, in the sense they are often very sticky. They may work even in circumstances in which they're not in people's interests because they can exploit inertia. That's a fair point, and it suggests a reason to be extremely careful with the design and transparency of default rules so that it doesn't end up that people end up stuck just because they're devoting their scarce attention to other issues. Okay. In Berlin in particular, but also in the United States, and I'm sure in the United Kingdom and France and Italy, there is concern. Who is the choice architect? That's the question. That is meant, I think, to be an objection rather than just a really good question. If the answer is meant sincerely, teachers and bosses and parents and cell phone companies and energy providers and stores and governments are choice architects. That's a fact. The question is meant to suggest, I think, that we ought to distrust choice architects, which is not unfair, but for the reasons given, it's pointless because there are going to be choice architectures, whether we like it or not. And the safeguard against what I think is the force of the question, that is the risk of insufficient information or illicit motivations on the part of choice architects, the remedies need to be transparency, which can produce market corrections under happy circumstances for private nudgers, or democracy as a safeguard under, I think, prevailing circumstances for public official nudgers. Okay, some nudges are indeed illicit because they have illicit ends. They can be meant to help interest groups, to entrench the current government. It's easy to imagine or even to define, to find sex discriminatory nudges or nudges that otherwise promote unfreedom. You can think, I think this isn't quite fair, but you can think of George Orwell's 1984 with its chilling last lines, "He loved Big Brother," as a warning about certain forms of choice architecture. Big Brother was interested in a lot of things other than choice architecture, so it's not quite fair, but it's instructive to see it that way. Okay, that is important because it suggests, as the public opinion data does, that there's a pervasive risk of illicit ends that underlie any form of government intervention, including choice-preserving ones. So the most serious objection to illicit ends ought to be an objection to mandates and bans. Nonetheless, it's fair for illicit ends. Okay, we can see choice-making as a muscle which atrophies if it isn't exercised. Default rules can be worse than active choosing for that reason. We might insist that active choosing is often the appropriate choice architecture because people can learn and create a capital stock in their minds from which they can benefit in the future. A default rule doesn't do that. It's not an educative intervention. That suggests that the benefit of learning is often an ingredient in our decision about what form of choice architecture to create, but it's not a decisive objection. There are some contexts in which learning has significant costs. It's a diversion from what people are rightly concerned about, and they are blessed by a default rule. Okay, the final objection or concern is the largest, and I think the one on which all of us should do a great deal of thinking in terms of the frontiers. And the welcome is a signal, I think, the welcome today is a signal for the centrality of this for the next generation. What is the relationship, and this is the question, between nudges and individual rights? Most of them, the 15 tested in the 20 or so nations in which they have been tested in terms of surveys, just have no adverse effect on rights. Some nudges, including anti-sex discrimination nudges being tried in the United Kingdom, help to promote rights or to make their realization possible. And if I were to put any of that in bold letters, it would be to make their realization possible. Think, if you would, of automatic enrollment in nutritional meals for children, which is recognizing statutory rights and making them possible. And there's a conception of rights in accordance with which food for kids who can't otherwise afford it is a right, which the nudge is necessary to make real. We need, I think, far more thinking on the question of how to connect norms of equality, freedom of religion, self-government, and freedom of speech with behaviorally informed interventions. Some imaginable nudges are rights violative and aren't acceptable for that reason, not because they are nudges. Other imaginable nudges, not tried, or maybe just a spark in some of your minds, the minds of people here right now, would be helpful or maybe indispensable for the real making of nudges which are purely formal for countless people today. I'll give a little mundane example that in some nations, voters are voters by virtue of the fact that they're legally entitled to be voters. They don't have to sign up. In other parts, they have to register. Predictably, a registration requirement means that lots of people won't be voters. A simple redesign of the choice architecture makes a massive difference. Now, my hope is you're thinking about areas untried so far in which a right, maybe enshrined in the Universal Declaration, isn't real, and behaviorally informed interventions would make them real. Okay, we have a 5-part Bill of Rights for nudging. Public opinion polls are not ordinarily the best basis for designing a Bill of Rights, but in this case, they are an inspiration. And partly the near universality of what's found in diverse nations is a clue, I think, that there's something in human culture which is consistent with the 5 ideas I'm going to highlight. The first, nudges must be consistent with people's values and interests. If they aren't, there's a serious problem. The government has a very heavy burden of justification. The second is nudges must be for legitimate ends. No religious or political favoritism, and no efforts by an existing government for self-entrenchment. By the way, in nations and places that are predominantly Christian, the idea of automatically assuming on the census that people are Christian is anathema, because it is thought to be illegitimately motivated. Nudges must not violate individual rights, even if they are popular. People don't want them to violate individual rights. They must be transparent, and much more work needs to be done on this topic. The 15 interventions I described in the nations with which I'm familiar, they are the furthest thing from hidden. Typically, they are provided for public scrutiny and review before they are finalized. RCTs, of course, can't be fully transparent. You can't tell someone in a randomized control trial, hey, you're in a randomized control trial right now. But afterwards, transparency about what's happened and an explanation is something that citizens are owed. Nudges ought not to take things from people without their consent. People in multiple nations get their backs up when they are automatically enrolled in a program, for example, by which some of their money is going even to a charity they like. They're okay with their money taken without their consent for their own savings plans, but they want their money to come away, if it's through a nudge, for something that they have given explicit consent to, not informed consent. Okay, now we're ready for the epilogue, which is just 2 questions. What's the most precious commodity that members of our species have? A commodity which the 2 great liberal philosophers of freedom, I think, Friedrich Hayek and Mill, did not sufficiently consider? Time. In their voluminous and great works, Hayek and Mill, the liberal tradition has devoted too little attention to the scarcity of time. What's the one thing that public officials, lawyers, doctors, and critics of nudges most often neglect? You think I'm going to say love? This isn't that kind of talk. Peace of mind. Thank you.